Hello tubers, and welcome to episode 6 of this series, which aims to recount the thrills and spills of our Iberian circumnavigation on and off the beaten track and on and off our KTM motorcycles. We rejoin the story, attempting to leave southeast Portugal's Monte Gordo, where we had holed up for 2 days R&R, but travelled for less than 10 minutes before I realised that, even at walking pace, the uncontrollable tank slapper I was not enjoying might be because there was no air in my front tyre. 2 days before, near the end of the very last dirt trail before we reached the Algarve's Atlantic coastline, I had felt a nasty pop as the edge of my front tyre caught a sharp, protruding rock. I had thought that's a snake bite for sure, but the tyre stayed resolutely full of wind and was still fully inflated 2 days later when we resumed our journey. A kilometre after that, it was not. My cut down crutch has already starred in a separate video on my channel, which you can watch if you're interested, and now it came into its own, supporting the bike on its side stand while raising the front to allow wheel removal. We added a strop attached to Noz's 1190 KTM as an extra security measure, and soon had the wheel out, the tyre off, the tube out, and sure enough found a triple-hole snakebite puncture, also known as a pinch flat. So in went the new spare 21-inch tube I had carried the length of Portugal, and following reassembly we were once again headed for the Spanish border with only about an hour lost. That makes it sound all very easy, doesn't it? And certainly it wasn't a drama, despite the intense heat and lack of available roadside shade. But there's a reason it was never going to turn into a drama, which, as you may have guessed, gives cause to offer yet another shout out to my partner in crime, Nozza. So far, this was the 4th time his practicality, extraordinary patience and frankly epic reserves of muscle power had been called into service. If you've seen the previous episodes of this series, you'll have noted that I'd already dropped the bike twice and then got stuck in some fairly deep sand, having headed down a wrong trail to an unfordable ford. Now I needed to wrestle off and back on a notoriously stiff-walled and narrow Mitas E07 front tyre. I'm not saying I'd have been completely scuppered without Noz's strength and know-how, but there's a pretty good chance I might still be in Portugal battling with any one of the aforementioned incidents had he not been there with me and always selflessly willing to get stuck in with his mighty helping hands. If there's a better person with whom to travel, then I've yet to meet them. Anyway, after crossing the Rio Guadiana and entering Spain, we immediately took to the dirt roads of Andalusia, and pretty soon after that decided that we didn't think much of them. These were dusty, uninteresting and uncomfortably corrugated. There seemed little point in riding them when great tarmac twisties abound in the area, but we continued until Noz's 1190 was consumed by deep soft sand at the trailhead of a particular lane. This finally made up our minds to see off a few 100 kilometres on the hard stuff and head towards Murcia, where I was certain some great trails awaited. On the long way there, we spent a comfortable night in Cordoba, but were disinclined to visit the many famous sites of that historic city. That's for a different sort of trip, really. So, after breakfast, we spent another day munching through 100 kilometres more on excellent and largely empty tarmac roads. Passing through literally tens of thousands of acres of olive groves until a threatening thunderstorm saw us head into the nearest town to find digs and some food. This turned out to be the unpretentious settlement of Pozo Alcon. Making no concessions to the tourist trade whatsoever, Pozo Alcon provided an interesting insight into normal, undiluted Spanish life. A young German-American couple, passing through on their bicycles while engaged in their own epic adventure, wild camping and battling dirt roads across the Iberian Peninsula, had, for some reason, perhaps social media notoriety, attracted a gaggle of teenage girls who had mobbed them across the town, unwilling to disperse until all possible records of their encounter with these hardy travellers had been created for their own social media lives. The third day of our bottom left to top right diagonal traverse of Spain saw us reach the dirt roads of Murcia, and they did not disappoint. These lanes were great, and the long hot day was studded with highlights and hilarity. This was partly because fate determined that this would be a good day to carry out the remainder of my falling off events for the trip. But before that, we came to this ford. Deploying my usual method of full commitment before engaging brain, I rode down to the water's edge through the thickest, slippiest, sloppiest wet clay. I stopped there, unable to see what the water depth was, so Noz, who had already dismounted to check the terrain and, perfectly reasonable, questioned my sanity thus far, slithered down the ramp and into the silty stream on foot, only to discover that it had a grippy concrete base and was so shallow it didn't even cover his toes. The problem, therefore, was not this unassuming trickle itself, but the fact that it had recently been a full-on river several feet deep and a great deal wider, meaning that the ramp down and back up the other side was now composed of a soft clay-like silt, possibly more suitable for the potter's wheel than transit by motorcycle. Still, we escaped the obstacle without drama, but in doing so coated our machines in a material which, in the hot sun, dried quickly to become not dissimilar to concrete, thus increasing our all-up weight by about 50 kilograms, and proving all but impossible to remove even with hammer and chisel. You could happily build the Taj Mahal with this stuff, and maybe they did. Murcia had not seen rain for a very long time, and the locals were delighted to have finally had an unusual amount in just a few days before our arrival. For them it meant their crops would survive and were growing at last. For us it had turned the terrain quite challenging in parts. Well, it challenged me at least. The inevitable eventually happening as down I went, caught out by another slippy rut, much as I had on the first dirt day in Portugal, but this time without injury to my noggin. Once again it was Nozza to the rescue, later pointing out that I was providing him with quite the workout for his arm muscles. Much more of me landing on my arse and he would be able to give a spinach-filled Popeye a run for his money. And to carry on landing on my arse I did, or at least my bike did. In this subsequent case, I just stepped away from the machine as it became absolutely determined to allow gravity to overcome verticality, whilst in between rows of olive trees that I shouldn't have been in between in the first place. This was not so much a navigational misstep as a completely inexplicable diversion from the obvious trail we'd been riding. For what would, remarkably, be the final time on our trip, the ever-patient, ever-willing Nozza was called upon to wander in my direction, first responder kit in hand, as always, to make sure my incompetence was on record. To his question, "Why have you ridden into a field?" I really had no answer at all. So we righted the clay-weighted monster and continued on to our next encounter. A brief spell of tarmac riding on this largely dirt-oriented day saw us stop for a spot of lunch at a roadside cafe. Despite the intense heat, this place had a large log fire blazing inside it, upon which the majority of a sizable pig was being roasted on a spit maintained by a young lady who was also serving the local workers at the bar, generally running the spot and managing her little son, while hubby was in the kitchen doing the cooking. Attempts to secure an ice cream for Noz fell foul of my having forgotten the requisite Spanish words, resulting in great hilarity as she variously offered him, in her booming tenor voice interspersed with ever more raucous laughter, the toilet, a chair, a bed, a steak, a used car, a coffee pot, some fish and a glass of water, before finally, during a detailed tour of the contents of her business, the pair lighted on the ice cream freezer, and the conundrum was resolved. To say this woman was a force of nature would be understating the situation entirely. I offered her somewhat bemused son a perch on my 790, which he seemed reasonably chuffed about, and after a very passable salad we took our leave of this humble place and its whirlwind proprietor, much amused and warmed by the encounter. And what an absolute surprise our next encounter was! After 2 countries, hundreds of kilometres and many days of trail riding on dirt roads so long as to seem almost without end, we met our very first gate. Upon the gate was a most apologetic sign which, once translated, read that the obstacle and its accompanying fencing was in place to protect an orchard of young almond trees, and would we mind very much shutting it after passing through, which of course we duly did. On the other side of the orchard was Spain's other gate, sporting the same apologetic and polite signage, which we treated in the same way as the first. And thereafter, as before, we simply never saw another gate. To some, say, stateside riders, for example, this may seem unremarkable, but to those of us who ride the trails in England and Wales, gatelessness is a treat beyond compare and very much worthy of note. After our day of many lovely dirt trails, we found a splendid forest campsite near Moratala, complete with hot showers, bar, restaurant, and a school party of around 50 extraordinarily well-behaved young'uns who were occupying several chalets in the forest along with their small posse of teachers. They were fed en masse in the tented restaurant area, driving us outside to seek a table in a quieter location for our own dinner. Later, the bar area was given over to them to sit on the floor and watch a movie until bedtime. During this period, a small breakaway group of slightly less well-behaved miscreants, being a little older and uninspired by the movie, had left the darkened makeshift cinema and repaired to the toilets to engage in a little light vandalism. These lads very soon became more well-behaved than they'd probably been in their entire lives when Nozza happened to find them, and had words which, despite being uttered in his native tongue, still left them in no doubt that clearing up their mess and getting the hell out of there was the only option likely to offer them even the slimmest hope of survival. I'll sign off this episode with just a very few snippets from the over 6 hours of footage I have from this day on Murcia's dirt trails. I've chosen the first clip because I think it really shows the gaping chasm that exists between a rider who has trials experience under his belt, to say nothing for natural talent, and one who doesn't. As always, the camera flattens out what was in places a pretty steep downhill section. There's a rounded off ridge between deep ruts. The lane has been baked hard by the sun, but its clay top surface then softened and made treacherous by recent rain. It's too slippery to stand or walk on comfortably, but we have to ride our overladen, in truth road-oriented, so-called adventure bikes down it. Any experienced trials rider will tell you that impetus is your friend here. Look well ahead, aim to keep up on that central peak and keep out of those ruts. Elbows out, toes in, knees out. Let the bike move below you, but stay upright yourself. Balance, relax, breathe. And of course, all their advice is valid and correct. But when confidence is in shorter than usual supply, perhaps thanks to earlier mishaps, when the ruts are so deep that a foot down will not meet with terra firma, a steadying dab instead resulting in a guaranteed topple, when your bike feels too top heavy and you wish you had your old enduro machine, or better yet your mountain bike in hand, when everything causes you to tighten up, ride slower and slower, and even stop altogether and then try and paddle along, making things worse for yourself than ever. Worst of all, when you know you're in the bloody way and your ineptitude is wrecking another's ride as well as your own. That's when you know you should have practiced and practiced some more with this bike carrying this weight before you came out to tackle this adventure. Then you find a spot to make way, and you get to watch an old trials rider on a bike far bigger than your own serenely sail past as if he's cruising down to the shops on a billiard table smooth tarmac road. This could hammer the final nail in the confidence coffin. RIP self-belief, and while we're on with the acronyms, how about SOS? But you cannot let that happen. You've got to keep trying, you've got to keep going. After all, you're in the middle of nowhere in a foreign country where they speak at least 3 and possibly more completely different languages, none of which are the one you were born to, but still only know about half of. So you remind yourself that you got this far and you enjoyed it. And you make a mental note to find some mud back in Blighty, not hard, and go back to motorcycle school. You know, that personal motorcycle school that you better be at for life, because once you think you know it all, that's when you're about to taste hospital food. Better yet, buy, beg or borrow a trials bike and go and learn that discipline, because everyone I know that has is a better rider than I'll ever be, whether they are out on the dirt lanes or pounding round Donington Park knocking out record lap times. Okay, well, since the average viewing time for a 15-minute short film is now about 2.5 minutes due to us living the age of TikTok fuckled attention spans, it's pretty unlikely you're still here, but if you are, we thank you, as always, from the bottom of our hearts for watching this. Hope you found something to chuckle about, and especially hope you'll join us once more for the next episode. Bye for now!